of our two talks tonight is by Isla MacFarlane, and she is, how would I describe you? In terms of the talk, but no, Isla is a journalist. She's a professional writer, but above all, and certainly for this evening, she is one of the most ferociously competitive vampire nerds that you're ever likely to meet. However, I do know there are at least two other ferociously competitive vampire nerds in the room who may say that no, that simply you're not competitive enough. But this will show. This will show. Isla's going to talk tonight about how vampire fiction cut its teeth. It's going back to the very beginnings of the vampire myth. Julie, could you take the lights down a little bit if you could? Thank you very much. And that's yours. And I will get out of your way. And you can wow us all. Oh, and turn that on. Yeah.
How do I turn that on?
Ah, with that.
Thank you. I don't have your booming voice. Good evening, everyone. It's actually difficult to know where to begin a talk on vampires, because every civilization has had a version of a monster that comes back from the dead to feed on the living, really since the dawn of time. But we're going to start in 1732, and that's because that's when the word vampire was printed in English for the first time. And it wasn't a story, it was a news report. There had been stories from Southeast Europe of villages that were being stalked by the undead. People claimed that dead relatives were coming back to life. Is the feedback okay for everyone?
I think it's a little bit closer.
We can hear you beautifully at the back, Danny.
Okay, excellent. Been coming back from the dead and terrorising the villages. Government officials got involved, they exhumed the bodies. They found that corpses were strangely uncomposed and had blood around their mouths. Now, it's most likely these people died from rabies, and it was simply a misunderstanding about how corpses decomposed in certain conditions. However, back then, it was far more sensible to assume that a vampire did it. So we had something called the Great Vampire Epidemic, or the Great Vampire Controversy, as it's sometimes known. Hundreds of corpses were dug up during this time. It was like a witch hunt for the undead. Fairly respected scholars like this gentleman, Dom Augustine Calmel, he wrote two really chunky books which sort of wrote case studies on the undead. He produced documented accounts, and the conclusion was vampires were real and they might come for you. Now this carried on for about 30 years, until Empress Maria Theresa essentially just told everyone to stop being so silly. She sent her personal physician to investigate. She concluded that vampires were not real, they did not exist, and she outlawed digging up corpses. However, it turns out the one thing you really can't kill is an idea. These things had form and a name for the first time, and they weren't going anywhere. Our first vampire poem appears in 1748 by this German gentleman, Henrik Augustin Osfelder. And as softly thou art sleeping, to thee I shall come creeping, and thy life's blood drain away. You get the idea. Then the Romantic poets basically started to give vampires bit parts in their epic poetry. Robert Southey did it in Thalaba the Destroyer, and Byron also gave a bit part to a vampire in his epic poet The Gale. He probably heard all the vampire myths while he was on his grand tour. The first full-length vampire poem came from John Stagg, a Cumbrian poet, in 1810. Some of it goes, the choir then burst the funeral dome where Sigismund was lately laid, and found him, though within the tomb, still warm as life and undecayed. With blood his visage was distained, ensanguined where his frightened eyes, each sign of former life remained, save all motionless he lies. So already vampires are really creeping closer to taking human form. In mythology, there'd been really little more than giant leeches. There'd been this big, bloody, bloated creatures, but they're actually starting to resemble human beings here. Most of the stories at this point were really similar. It was usually a lover coming back from the grave to take revenge. And vampires at this point, they were little more than zombies. But that all changed in 1816. It was the year without summer. A freak climate event basically plunged England into an eternal winter. And against this backdrop, 3 friends were staying at a villa in Geneva. I say 3 friends, there are obviously 4 people in the picture. We have 18-year-old Mary Godwin. I can point at them apparently. So we have an 18-year-old Mary Godwin. We have her future husband Percy Shelley. Have Lord Byron over there. By this point, Lord Byron has been chased out of England by a string of jilted lovers, illegitimate children and debtors. He's really a rock star of his time. And we also have John Polidori, who was Byron's personal physician. I feel so sorry for John Polidori. He was absolutely made to feel like an outcast on this trip. And I think, by all accounts, he was pretty much always an outsider. He had graduated in medicine at the freakishly young age of 19. By law, you couldn't practice medicine at that time until you were 26, so he was very much in a sort of strange hiatus. He had jumped at the chance to be Byron's personal physician because really, he was absolutely desperate to be a writer. He wasn't like the others in this group. His parents weren't wealthy, they weren't intellectuals. He's from a really ordinary family. He kept trying to show poems and plays he'd written to Lord Byron. Lord Byron was pretty cruel. They were laughed at and then they were mocked. By all accounts, he was quite ungainly. He was often spilling things or tripping over things. And to top it all off, he was hopelessly in love with Mary Godwin, but she only had eyes for Percy Shelley. Now, the famous story goes, on a particularly gloomy night, they had a contest to see who could come up with the creepiest story. It's actually not quite accurate. There were 4 participants in this game. John Polidori also threw his hand in, but his contribution was so undervalued it's never even mentioned. The winner, of course, was Mary Godwin, with her story about a creature stitched together from human corpses and eventually made into a monster because, what do you know, society isn't particularly kind to creatures stitched together from human corpses. You might have heard of it. The runner-up was Lord Byron. Lord Byron had a good idea. Up until this point, vampires had always been peasant stock. Lord Byron thought it would be quite fun to turn them into sort of someone aristocratic, a bit like himself. However, he didn't get very far with it. He tossed it to one side when he didn't win, and that might have been the end of it, except it gave John Polidori an even better idea. What if he actually took this character that Lord Byron had created, but he actually based him on Byron himself? Now, he wasn't the first writer to do this. Lord Byron's ex-lover, Lady Caroline Lamb, had already written a novel called Glenarvan, which features a sort of very thinly veiled caricature of Lord Byron, and it's not very flattering. She really wanted to show the world what a bastard he was. The character was called Lord Ruthven. Byron took this character, didn't change the name, essentially made that character into a vampire. He claims he spends the next 2 months developing this story, but it doesn't actually... Oh, here we are. Like, artist's impression of what that vampire might have been like. It does make complete sense that really the Adam of vampire literature is a Byronic hero. Sort of cynical, arrogant, moody, capable of love and doing good, but more often than not cocks it up. Lady Caroline Lamb would describe Byron as mad, bad, and dangerous to know. And you give those qualities to a vampire, you've got a bestseller. So John Polidori's tale, The Vampire, ends up quite mysteriously in the hands of a publisher in 1819. Polidori goes to his grave swearing that he didn't give his permission for it to be published. This is highly unlikely. What's more likely is that he saw the success that Mary Shelley had with Frankenstein, and he cut a deal with the publisher. What almost certainly wasn't part of that deal was that he isn't credited. The story is credited to Lord Byron. It's most likely an effort to boost sales, but both writers are absolutely fuming about this. Lord Byron thinks very much the joke's on him. He really doesn't like the fact that he's got this sort of literary evil twin running about, and he considers it very much beneath him. John Polidori is obviously devastated. This was his one shot at glory, and he doesn't even get the credit. In an effort to clear up the confusion, Lord Byron publishes his original short story that he wrote in 1816. It is eventually credited to Polidori. It doesn't do Polidori much good by this stage. His mental health has taken a real downward turn, and however much he tells people that he wrote this story, everyone pretty much still thinks of it as Byron's idea. I think this is really unfair because Polidori did take the idea from Byron, and he did take the concept from Lady Caroline Lamb, but there's something about the way the book's written. It's got a wonderful otherness to it, and I think that's really part of the seductive quality of the book. It's got a sense of somebody watching people from the shadows, and it could really only have been written by someone like Polidori, who had always lived his life on the periphery. I think it's tragic he never got to see the influence that this book actually had. He dies just 2 years after it's published. It's an absolute publishing smash. Every print run sells out pretty much straight away. It's translated into numerous different languages around the world. Countless unauthorized sequels, prequels, parallels, parodies, all start cropping up all over the world. And we're not talking fan fiction. Really established writers had a go at it, including Alexander Dumas, who's sort of much more well known for writing The Count of Monte Cristo or The Three Musketeers. He also wrote The Return of Lord Ruthven, which is an unauthorised sequel, and he later wrote The Pale Lady, which was his own effort at a vampire story. But I think the most interesting sort of response to the vampire actually came on the back of the Haitian Revolution. Now, this was the largest slave uprising since Spartacus, and unlike Spartacus, it was successful. It resulted in the founding of the first country founded by former slaves, and the world's first sovereign black state. Hundreds of white refugees fled to America. Slave owners over there were understandably getting a bit nervous. Now, on the back of this, we have America's first vampire story, The Black Vampire. It tells the story of a slave who is killed by his captor. He returns as a vampire to seek revenge. He kills his captor, he marries his wife, and they have a vampire baby together. So we have a mixed race marriage, a mixed race baby. It's 50 years before the abolition of slavery. It's also 15 years before Lydia Child publishes an appeal in favour of that class of Americans called Africans, which is largely considered to be America's first anti-slavery book. So it's America's first vampire story. It's the first vampire of colour. It has a really strong claim to being the first anti-slavery short story. Among vampire nerds, it's quite often known as the first comedic vampire story. To be honest, it's extremely silly. It's written in a really cartoonish style. The author actually introduces it by saying this is really quite simple nonsense. To be honest, I think that's the only reason he could actually get away with publishing it. It's also published under a pseudonym. We actually have no idea who wrote it. But it does start a spate of vampire stories that explore race. A historical example would be Florence Marryat, who wrote The Blood of a Vampire. This is a novel about a mixed race vampire, and it sort of draws parallels between sort of walking in two worlds, but not really belonging to either. Now, by this point, vampire stories are really dominating sort of magazines and journals. It was only a matter of time before one cropped up in the Penny Dreadful. And here he is. This is Varney. Varney the Vampire ran for 2 years, which is actually a really long time for a Penny Dreadful. It was eventually sort of cobbled together into a book. I'll be honest, I actually haven't read all of this book because it's one of the longest books ever written. Second only to Proust. It's longer than the entire Lord of the Rings series, including The Hobbit. It's longer than War and Peace, Les Miserables, Gone with the Wind. If it was a Netflix series, I think fans would be up in arms. That there's really quite alarming plot holes and plot inconsistencies. But you can't leave Varney out of talk on vampires because so much of his DNA runs through modern vampire fiction. He's the first vampire to have fangs. With a plunge, he seizes her neck in his fang-like teeth. And thereafter, however, vampires fed on their victims was no longer a mystery. They pretty much all had fangs after that. He's also the first sympathetic vampire. Varney is very much portrayed as this victim of circumstance. He hates his condition. He hates the fact that he's got his bloodlust that forces him to feed on people that he actually quite likes. He's a very introspective vampire. I think very much the literary ancestor of that sort of sharp, cheek-boned, coat-swishing vampires that we're all pretty familiar with now. Bill Compton from True Blood, Angel from Buffy, Louis from Interview with the Vampire, who's looking a bit blurry there, maybe he doesn't show up on camera. Varney is killed several times in the series and brought back to life. I imagine the writers got pretty sick of him, but he was always brought back by demand from fans. He's not always brought back by blood. Often he's revived by electricity, by a medical student. And this is something that really would have been in the public consciousness. Around 1803, some fairly gruesome experiments began trying to resuscitate corpses with electricity. It was usually on the body of a condemned criminal. He finally succeeded in 1870 when he had the first precursor to the defibrillator. But I think it was the first time it was really thought it was going to be scientifically possible to bring someone back from the dead. We have this fairly grisly cartoon from 1836. I don't think it's no coincidence that we have these horror stories at a time when people were seeing the lines between life and death being blurred in this way. Now, by this time, Gothic literature has been running for about a quarter of a century. It's a little bit past its best by now. A lot of writers are trying to write in that style with variable quality. It's really beginning to sort of fray at the seams. However, there is one writer that is still on everyone's lips, and that writer is Anne Radcliffe. I've called her the Queen of Gothic Literature here. She's really more like the mother of Gothic literature. She was a real early pioneer of the genre, and she inspired many of the Romantic poets. She's often referred to as the Shakespeare of the Romantic poets. Certainly she inspired Byron, Coleridge. She went on to inspire writers such as Edgar Allan Poe, Walter Scott and Keats. She wrote 5 novels in her lifetime, the famous of which being The Mysteries of Udolpho. She had a penchant for leaving young orphaned heroines in really dangerous situations, often in crumbling castles. She had her critics too. Even though she was the most popular author of her day, certainly not everybody loved her. The situations she put her heroines in were often ludicrous. She features long descriptions of countries that she's never actually been to, so they're fairly idiosyncratic. I think one of her severest critics was Jane Austen. Jane Austen famously parodies the Mysteries of Udolpho in her novel Northanger Abbey. To quote here from a character in Northanger Abbey saying, "I've read all Mrs. Radcliffe's books, she's brilliant, couldn't put the Mysteries of Udolpho down." Jane Austen only ever wrote about what she knew. I mean, this is pretty reflective of standard conversation, and this is about 30 years after the novel has been published. It's very easy to forget or simply not know that at one time everyone read Anne Radcliffe. She commanded astronomical fees. She was as ubiquitous as J.K. Rowling. You would be excellent. However, her contribution to literature is really understated. She's never really given the credit she deserves. I'm sure this isn't because she's a woman, but in 2023, only 2% of pupils at GCSE level studied a text written by a female author. And in the years leading up to that, only 2% of pupils studied a novel with a female protagonist. Now, early vampire fiction actually has some pretty spicy female protagonists, and I think that's because it was a really good way of subverting the norms. These are some sort of notable modern female vampires, and many of them did have their roots in the early stories. I don't know how else she could have had sort of powerful, independent, wealthy, sexual woman at the time without making her into a vampire. And that's exactly what this gentleman did. His name was Paul Favell. He's better known as the father of crime fiction, but he did try his hand at vampire fiction in the 1860s. His first crack was the Vampire Countess, which features a beguiling, seductive countess called Countess Adema. His second crack at it was a novel called Vampire City, which features history's first female vampire hunter. Now, Paul Favell thought it would be really fun to cast someone famous in this role. He thought if I took a really well-known figure and turned them into a vampire hunter, I mean, that's got to be a bestseller. And he was right, and our first female vampire hunter was Anne Radcliffe. He essentially wrote this completely bonkers story where Anne Radcliffe's sister is kidnapped and taken to the Vampire City by the evil Count Otto, and Anne Radcliffe goes with her own sort of Victorian Scooby Gang, goes to rescue her. It is a pretty zany narrative, and unless you're absolutely fascinated by the politics of Napoleon III, I would recommend skipping the first 3 chapters. However, she's an absolute brilliant literary ancestor for characters like Buffy, and I think it really had to be Anne Radcliffe in this role. I don't know who else could have done it. Her narratives really gave women permission to have adventures, to do something other than just get married and have kids. She essentially gave women permission to drive the narrative, and it is something that obviously a path writers like the Brontes then took. So I think she made an excellent vampire hunter, and it also is a very nice prototype for novels that mix sort of vampire fiction, fantasy and history. Novels like Abraham Lincoln Vampire Hunter. Also the author of Pride and Prejudice and Zombies, which I actually do recommend. It's very funny. Female vampires at the time were also, they were allowed to be kind of gay. And this gave Sheridan Le Fanu, hugely influential horror writer, the inspiration to write what I would probably controversially argue is one of the most influential horror stories, vampire stories to be written. In 1872, he wrote Carmilla. Now this is the story of a young woman who lives in an isolated castle with her father. They're joined by the beautiful young noblewoman, Carmilla. Lots of women in the nearby village start dying very mysterious deaths, and Laura forms this really intense companionship with Carmilla. It's said that it's hinted that this is a lesbian love story. I don't think it's hinted, I think it's pretty explicit. Sometimes after an hour of apathy, my strange and beautiful companion would take my hand and hold it with a fond pressure, renewed again and again, blushing softly, gazing in my face with languid and burning eyes, and breathing so fast that her dress rose and fell with a tumultuous respiration. I don't think there's much room for interpretation there. I think Sheridan Le Fanu was the conservative son of a clergyman. He's not being an ally for gay rights, but I think he is playing on a real fear of the time. And there's a real fear of a rise of female power as well. In just a few years earlier, in 1867, you'd had the first debate in Parliament about women's suffrage. Men and Carmilla are actually pretty superfluous. The protagonist, Laura's father, he's not even given a name. It's strongly hinted in the prologue and the conclusion. They don't even actually succeed in defeating Carmilla. It's very much a story about a powerful woman and a female protagonist who's pulled into her orbit, and that scared the pants of a Victorian audience. Whether he meant to or not, Le Fanu did create the prototype for the queer vampire, and really laid the groundwork for stories like this. This is from the film, The Interview with the Vampire, published in 1975. The author Anne Rice referred to the characters here, Lestat and Louis, as the first vampire same-sex parents. Lestat is famously queer in the novels. You also have series like True Blood, which tells the story of vampires discovering a synthetic blood, so they don't need to kill anyone anymore. They come out of the coffin, and they're fighting for equal rights. And there's a lot of similarities with hate speech, such as God hates fangs. The series is based on the book series, The Southern Vampire Mysteries by Charlene Harris. I'm referencing the TV series rather than the books because the books are really awful. But the first four series of the TV is really good. You also have the Gilda stories by Joelle Gomez. This tells the story of a runaway slave who is essentially ends up in a lesbian brothel. It's actually very good. I do recommend it. It was written in the 1990s. He also laid the formula for what I like to call themes with benefits. Now, this is a well-worn formula. If you're familiar with vampire fiction, you'll recognise all the stories in this. A really lonely and confused teenager is befriended by a vampire. You see it in novels like Let the Right One In, which is written by a Swedish author called John Lindqvist. Tells the story of a really rough suburb in Stockholm in the 1980s, and it deals with paedophilia, it is with alcoholism, fatherlessness. It's quite a harrowing read, but it's very good. I think there's been a few adaptations of it as well. You have the Radleys, which is essentially what happens when vampires move to the suburbs, go vegan, and start shopping in Waitrose. It's very witty, actually. I do recommend it. If you're an 80s child, this might have been your gateway to vampire fiction. It was mine. Stephen King, very famously, his premise for Salem's Lot was, okay, what would happen if a vampire just rocked up in a really normal, sleepy town? I personally think the result was the scariest vampire novel that's ever been written. It's absolutely terrifying, but brilliant. Now, my argument for why Carl Miller is the most significant vampire novel written is because among its biggest fans was Bram Stoker. It was written about 25 years before Dracula. There are so many parallels between Dracula and Carl Miller. After Dracula, in 1914, Bram Stoker's short story, Dracula's Guest, was published. Now, it tells the story of an unnamed protagonist, widely believed to be Jonathan Harker, and he's travelling through forests in Austria, which is exactly how Carmilla starts and exactly where Carmilla's set. He comes to a graveyard with a grave with Carmilla's name on it, and he meets this beguiling, beautiful, young, noble woman who is the vampire. It was discovered relatively recently that Dracula's Guest was actually the deleted first chapter to Dracula. So the publisher told Bram Stoker to cut it because he thought it was superfluous to the plot and the novel was getting too long. However, I think it does show that he really meant to pay tribute to Carmilla. Dracula is, I will also mention, if you do like the novel Dracula, the part with the 3 vampires in Dracula's castle, there's a line that says they resemble the woman that Jonathan Harker had met in the graveyard. And if Dracula's Guest had actually been the opening chapter, that line would have made complete sense. So by the time Stoker writes Dracula, the vampire genre is nearly 100 years old. Most of the myths have already been established. Stoker adds a couple of his own. Vampires having no reflection, and the fact that vampires are repelled by garlic. This doesn't actually go down that well with critics. They call it unintentionally funny. However, what Stoker actually does is he makes vampire fiction contemporary. He takes it from the forests of Eastern Europe to modern day London, or what would have been modern day London for a Victorian audience. Really, it's the first time vampires have been a middle class problem. Up until then, they've stalked peasants and they've stalked the upper classes. In Stoker's novel, they were coming after lawyers and secretaries. He really plays on the fears of the time. In the sort of 1890s, you had a run on banks, and there was a real fear of the faceless corporation and the foreign investor. And then Dracula rocks up in London, the ultimate foreign investor. He's snapping up prime London property. He's threatening to drain victims and make them his puppets. There's a lot of context to Dracula. And actually critics at the time said really the success of the novel was his ability to sort of blend the fantastic with the everyday, with the familiar. An awful lot of what we think of when we think of Dracula either comes before or after it. I certainly think a lot of the sensuality that people associate with Dracula really comes from Carmilla. And an awful lot of it comes from the films which came later. His iconic cloak was actually a stage device. Dracula was a successful stage play, kind of in between the book and Nosferatu, and it was used by actors to cover trapdoors when they needed to disappear. Dracula is a vampire of few words in the novel, the sort of whole smart talking vampire, sort of suave. I mean, that's really from Christopher Lee. The love affair between Nina and Dracula, which if I'm honest I find really irksome. I think it does the character of Nina a massive disservice. And that's all the fault of the 90s film Dracula, somewhat ironically called Bram Stoker's Dracula. Vampires were always nocturnal, but daylight didn't kill them until that beautiful scene at the end of Nosferatu, where Orlok the vampire vanishes and turns to dust in the daylight. Now, if I was a super vampire nerd, I would make something called an engram of the word vampire. Now, an engram is something that analyses published texts over the last 2 centuries to see how frequently a word was used. So here it is. So you can really see the influence of certain authors. I can use my magic pointy here. So here he's getting those gruesome news reports coming in. Then vampire fiction reaches a peak that doesn't actually see again for many hundreds, many more decades. This is sort of when John Polidori's The Vampire was published. Starts to trail off. Dracula really has the last word in vampire fiction. There's a lull here. I actually don't think it's particularly because vampires lost popularity, but it's because they migrated to films, and this sort of studies published text. You get a lovely bump here. Stephen King's novel Salem's Lot was published in 1975, and Anne Rice published Interview with the Vampire in 1975. I think this bump is mostly Anne Rice, actually. She pretty much single-handedly revived the genre, and it did have a massive impact. I think she really brought vampires closer to being human, more than any other author, really, since Ronnie the Vampire was on the scene. It tails off here, but it picks up again in the mid-1990s, shoots right back up to when it had been at its peak, when John Polidori published The Vampire. Can anyone hazard a guess as to what happened in the mid-90s that might have revived an interest in vampire fiction?
Twilight.
This happened. I still love it. If anyone wants to feel really old, Buffy the Vampire Slayer aired in 1997, which was nearly 30 years ago. In 10 years' time, I can legitimately do a history talk on Buffy the Vampire Slayer. But it gave millions of women a complex female superhero, which was badly needed. But I also think it really embodied the best of vampire fiction. It let primal fears bleed into the everyday. But more than that, it took it back to John Polidori's original mission statement, which is this is a genre written by outsiders for outsiders. I think vampire fiction at its best, and I think the reason it attracts so many awkward teenagers, much like I was, is because it represents people on the periphery who are just waiting to be invited in. That is my history of vampire fiction. Thank you very much.